Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Hey, Benny sent me a story. Several people sent it to me, though, because they knew the headline would catch my eye. But the funny thing is that the first iteration of the headline I saw actually caught my eye because I thought it was not what it turns out to be. And it says, attorney punched in the Hennepin. And I thought, that sounds painful. But of course, I know what Hennepin is. It's a place. And he wasn't punched in the Hennepin. He was punched in the head while in the Hennepin County Courthouse. So this is a story out of the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And I know it's Minneapolis, St. Paul, all that stuff. But the story goes, attorney hospitalized after client punches him in Hennepin court. Attorney Justin Braulick was standing next to his client in the courtroom when he suddenly found himself waking up on the floor, which reminds me of another funny story about waking up on the floor. Remind me. I'll tell you at the end. Braulick, the attorney, looked over and saw his client on the ground with about 4 deputies trying to restrain him. The county sheriff's office, which provides security, said that Braulick was punched once by his client in the head. Braulick said Monday afternoon he did not remember being punched. He recalled standing next to his client during sentencing in a criminal sexual conduct case and then waking up on the floor. And there's a little bit of a gap there in his memory. Braulick said, I'm kind of shaken up a little bit and a little sore. The client was already in custody, was taken back to jail. The attack on Braulick remains under investigation, and the client has not been charged, but obviously he could be because he did something bad in front of a whole bunch of people, allegedly. The Star Tribune generally does not name suspects who have not been charged, so that's why they're dancing around this one. Braulick said he blacked out for about 30 seconds after he was punched and was diagnosed with a concussion. It's unclear if he got the concussion from getting hit or falling down. Both are possible. Obviously, it can happen any time, but it's shocking that someone would do that, especially in open court when the judge is addressing you, said Stephen Heller, owner and president of the St. Cloud-based law firm Heller and Thien, which is the firm that Braulick works for. According to Braulick, he and his 39-year-old client were standing at a podium in the courtroom, and the client wanted to withdraw a guilty plea he'd entered a month ago. The judge denied the withdrawal and asked the client if he wanted to proceed with sentencing. And then Braulick says, I just remember lying on the ground. So there's a little, like I said, that's the timeline. Judge asks, would you like to proceed with sentencing? And then the attorney wakes up on the floor. Braulick didn't recall the client saying anything before the punch or while 4 deputies restrained him. And about a half a dozen more deputies entered the courtroom to try to calm down the brouhaha. Paramedics arrived to assess Braulick and transport him to the Hennepin County Medical Center, where he was treated and released a few hours later. Braulick said, I can't thank the deputies and the EMTs enough. They were really fast and on top of it. And while this whole thing has shocked him, he said it won't discourage him. He handles cases regularly in Minneapolis and across the state and plans on continuing to do so. He said, emotions run high and a lot's at stake. I think people sometimes don't operate with the most clear vision at the time. And he called it an isolated incident. Heller said of Braulick, he's an extremely hard worker and conscientious. He works hard for his clients. So court records show that the client received a term of about 8 years in prison for the thing he was being sentenced on that day in court, when he is alleged to have punched his attorney in the head, knocking him out. And I would never make light of assaulting another person, but there are some stories that pop into my mind when I hear stories like this. And one of my favorite stories involves Bobby. I always look the wrong way. Involves Bobby Isaac, who's the guy who raced in NASCAR in a Dodge Daytona that looked like that in 1969, 1970. And Bobby Isaac, I wrote a book about him, was a very, very interesting character. He won the national championship in 1970 as a NASCAR driver, driving that car and a few others. And he did not like to give interviews to the press because whenever he spoke to them, he got the impression they were speaking down to him. And they probably were. He wasn't illiterate, but he was not very well spoken, and he was quiet. And I interviewed people who knew him, and like David Pearson. And David Pearson said, well, once you got to know him, he'd be talkative. But around strangers, he was quiet. Around the press, he was quiet. But the interesting thing is I've seen footage of him at a track surrounded by children who were asking for autographs. And he was signing autographs like, there was no tomorrow. But when it came to, reporters asking him questions and so on, he often didn't give interviews. He often didn't like to give interviews. And when he was cornered and gave an interview, they were often very short. And so after he won the national championship in 1970, Car and Driver magazine, I believe it was, contacted his team. K&K Insurance was the owner of his team. And they contacted K&K and said, we'd like to interview Bobby about winning the national championship. It's a big deal, And Nord Krauskopf, who owned the team and owned the car and really respected Bobby Isaac both as a driver and as a person, told Bobby, hey, they'd really like to interview you, but he also wouldn't force him to do the interview. He basically just said, Bobby, it's up to you. Do you want to do the interview? And Bobby didn't want to do the interview because he was worried about a big national magazine asking him all kinds of questions and possibly trying to make him look stupid because other reporters had done that. They'd actually said that he was illiterate, he didn't know how to sign his own name, and all kinds of crazy stuff that wasn't true. So he didn't give the interview to the journalist. And I could be wrong. I apologize. It might not be Car and Driver, but it was one of the national car magazines. It was not like one of the local NASCAR magazines. And so what happened was the journalist was required to write the story with or without Bobby's participation. And so the guy, apparently having an axe to grind at this point, wrote the article in which he suggested that Bobby Isaac won the national championship, which is a good thing for him because with his skill set, if he didn't know how to drive a car, he'd probably be out robbing banks. That's what he said. And Bobby didn't take it kindly. And the interesting thing is that Bobby read the article, which is an interesting thing to do if you're illiterate. And I read an interview with that writer who said that, I wrote this article about Bobby Isaac in which I said some unkind things. And he goes, the next time I saw Bobby Isaac, I was laying flat on my back, unconscious, and I opened my eyes trying to remember where I was. And as I opened my eyes, I realized I was laying on the floor of a lobby of a hotel. And moments earlier, I'd been walking through the lobby, and someone walked up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Are you?" And, asked him if he was who he was. And he said, I turned around, and just as I turned around, I said, yes. And I recognized Bobby Isaac. And Bobby said, I read your article. And there was the gap in the man's memory, because he said that the moment he heard Bobby Isaac say, I read your article, he then blacked out and woke up laying flat on his back in the lobby of the hotel. And there's Bobby Isaac leaning over him, looking down. Yeah, I read your article. So not only did Bobby know how to read, but apparently he understood irony, because telling the man who had called him illiterate that he'd read the article was, of course, a punchline of sorts. So nothing ever came of that little exchange other than the guys just decided to both go their way. In other words, the man did not press charges against Bobby Isaac. Bobby Isaac would then go on and race for a few more years, and then he passed away in 1977. Oddly enough, he passed away the same week that Elvis Presley died. And so outside of the stock car circles and outside of North Carolina, not many people heard about Bobby Isaac's passing, which is very sad. Wonderful driver, an enigma, really unusual character, but an entertaining one, if nothing else. And he only won a few big races on the big tracks. He won once at Daytona, but not the 500. He won one of the July 4th firecracker races. And he won a race at the Texas International Speedway at the end of 1969. But the people who raced with him and against him in the 60s in particular would tell you that when it came to small tracks, short tracks, especially on dirt, Bobby Isaac was a wizard. And there were drivers who raced against him that I interviewed for my books and my various projects. I've spoken to Richard Petty about him. I've spoken to David Pearson about him, Buddy Baker. And they all said, they go, when it came to racing on dirt, I've spoken to Ned Jarrett also. When it came to racing on dirt, watching Bobby Isaac race was like watching a master of any sport or any occupation. The guy could he'd have the car going sideways at full speed, full throttle, under perfect control, next to another car that was only inches away from his, and they wouldn't touch. And they could do that for lap after lap after lap after lap. And he won so many races on small courses like Hickory and so on, that especially in small towns, he was a hero down there. But I've digressed way too far. So back to the attorney who's punched in the Hennepin courthouse. Got my attention because I'm an attorney. I've never had a client punch me. But then again, this is a news story because it's unusual. Like I said, dog bites man's not headlines, but man bites dog is. So the fact that the guy did this is why it made headlines. But my thoughts and prayers go out to the man who's been punched in the Hennepin. And Benny, thanks for passing along the article. Questions, comments, put them below. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Well, that was mildly amusing.